Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our October dialogue. My name's Tom Dennis. I'm the CEO of Serenity and Leadership. We're a premier specialist culture remodeling organization. We help businesses overcome challenges and achieve successful, lasting outcomes whilst always putting people at the heart of the business. I'd like to introduce our speaker. Raggi's a race educator who identifies as a South Asian, queer, cisgendered woman. She's a human rights barrister with more than 20 years experience. She's focused on challenging issues of racism, gender violence, and mental health through law, social action, and policy. She has a long history of anti-oppression work and has been involved with the setup and running of numerous groundbreaking and award-winning projects. Raggi, as you've already heard, we're really looking forward to hearing what you've got to say. The stage is yours. Over to you.
Thank you, Tom. I notice there's a lot of anxiety in my system, right? And I'm really, as we've been doing the introductions, I've been really wondering why I'm feeling so anxious, because I talk about racism all the time. I facilitate, I train, I hold dialogue spaces, I write, right? I live and breathe and dream talking about racism, right? Why do I feel so anxious now, right? So I'm wondering, first of all, is it all mine? Maybe a lot of it is what's happening in the room. Maybe a lot of you are feeling that already. Roxy, you just talked about that. So maybe I'm just holding what's in the space. And maybe also it's the challenge of talking about challenging the dynamics of racism in 15 minutes. Right? How do we do that? Right? So I'm like, I've tried to kind of think in so many ways how I can make this punchy and change you all and shift all the dynamics, knowing that in this room there's so much brilliance already. There's so much awareness. There's people that are running these issues all over the place. There's DEI experts, etc. So how do I address this in a way that's impactful? So I really hope that I get that right. What I'm going to do is I'm going to actually just talk a little bit about my story, and then I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the dynamics that I experience, just very briefly, and some of the gaps that I see, and just leave you to talk about those gaps. I'm going to be looking down here quite a lot because that's where my iPad is with my notes, right? So for us to challenge the dynamics of racism, right, it requires all of us to show up, okay? It's not just about people like me showing up and shifting these dynamics by education. It requires all of us to recognize that these dynamics impact all of us. We're all socialized and conditioned around the dynamics of racism, and it requires all of us to show up to bring the change that we want to see, yeah? I was born in 1968, right? I grew up in North London suburbs. It was a very white area. When I went to, we were probably one of the only Asian families, right? And 1968 was an important year because it was the year that a man called Enoch Powell, who was a Conservative MP, and I see nods already in the room, did a speech called the Rivers of Blood speech, right? He spoke to a group of Conservative politicians, and he was very right-wing, and he spoke out against what he saw as mass migration. The common citizens from the Commonwealth, who were made up of those that were previously colonized, were British through legislation and were allowed to come to the UK. So there'd been huge levels of migration in the 50s and in the early 60s. So he spoke a lot about that, and he spoke very strongly against the anti-racism legislation that was coming into force. It was the Race Relations Act of 1968, right? And there was a massive kind of outcry following his speech, okay? It got a lot of press. Everybody was talking about racism, and it led to a massive explosion of racism in the UK. Yeah, I'm mostly talking about the UK. And how did that play out, right? I'm born then, right? By the time I hit primary school, early primary school, I'm experiencing and witnessing racism, right? And that just increased and increased as I went through primary school. By the time I get to early secondary school, I can't get to the end of my road without somebody calling me Packy, right? Every day somebody's chasing me, somebody's trying to attack me. It was a regular daily experience. And as I say this, even though I've talked about my story so many times, I can feel the dizziness and fizziness in my system, which is the trauma response, right? And it's also probably what's happening in the room, in everybody's bodies. So let's take a breath. By the time I was leaving secondary school, things shifted. Things started to shift for me personally. And as I was going to college and starting out in work, things really started to shift. And what I know now from my political awareness now is that there was a massive rise up of different communities. Black and Asian communities came together. They went out onto the streets and they really protested strongly, and they challenged the racism that they were experiencing, right? At the same time, the younger generation were coming through who had grown up living amongst people from different communities and who started to say no. And we really experienced a change in the UK about what was okay and what was not okay. And at that stage, it was no longer okay to be openly, blatantly racist, overtly racist. And so personally, my experiences really changed in the world, right? But we never addressed the reasoning and the socialization and the conditioning that led to all of that racism. We just created a system where it was no longer okay to be openly racist. So the behaviors and the thoughts and the ideas were still there, but they became hidden, right? And racism continued, but in a more covert way. And as I was growing up, I remember people, saying to me, yeah, things have changed, right? But the stories of the racism that we experienced were still huge, right? And people were saying, at least we knew where it was before. At least it was blatant and we can see it. And now, although it's insidious, we can't see it, and therefore it's harder to challenge, right? By the age of 30, I became a barrister. I became a human rights barrister. And oh my God, that was such a cool time, right? I was a political lawyer, and I was an immigration and asylum lawyer, and I got taken on in the top political set. And I remember when I got pupillage, am I all right on time, Tom? Yeah, give me like a 3-minute warning or something, right? I remember when I got pupillage, right? I was at law school at the time, and I went to one of the poshest law schools, thinking I needed to be there to have the name in order to make it in law, right? And somebody came up to me and said, wow, I've never met anyone who hasn't been to public school before. And I was like, yeah, there's only like 2 of us here, right? And in my class, only 2 of us got pupillage, and I was one of them. And there was this whole conversation saying, you can tell the system's really fucked up if Raggi got pupillage and we didn't. But of course, I got taken on in the top political set because I was great. I was really good, and I was really political, and I really showed up, and I deserved it, right? My experiences in early law were horrific, right? They were really horrific. The racism was so huge, right? But everybody had this idea that we're fighting for justice. We're not about racism. The world has changed. But really, for people that looked like me, it hadn't really changed that much at all. Yeah. So I think I just want to set that as a framework, right? Now I spend all of my time talking about race, right? I'm training, right? I do a lot of work with lawyers. I do a lot of work in charities and businesses. I hold dialogue spaces. I coach, I facilitate, right? I'm in conversations on race all the time. And I think what I want to do is I want to talk about a couple of the dynamics that I come across. First of all, I talk to the wider group, and I also do a lot of work with people that look like me, right? Racialized people, Black and brown, right? And the stories that I hear are really similar across the board, right? Experiences of racism, right? It may not be blatant being called the N-word or being called a packy, or, you know, all of these horrible things that we used to experience. It may not be like that, right? But we're being spoken over at meetings. We're being asked to join panels in order to have a brown face on. We're not being promoted. We're not being invited to, you know, to join, you know, to go for a drink, or, you know, there's just so many different dynamics that play out that impact us, right? And what I hear from people that look like me is just a huge level of trauma and distress and upset, and that these dynamics continue to play out again and again and again, right? And then when I talk to the organizations, well, everybody's shifted, right? Woohoo! George Floyd got killed and everybody's understood that we have to challenge racism. And I am so grateful, right? I really do mean that. I'm really grateful that people are showing up and that they want to do the work. And I really believe that there's a lot of good intent there. But when you talk to them, it's like, yeah, we know that there's these dynamics, but it's not here. I don't hold these dynamics. It's not me. I don't think like that. It's not my team. It's not my organization. It's not here. It's out there, but it's not here. What we need is we need to get more Black and brown people coming into the organization. They don't apply to us, right? I don't know why that is. We need to get more Black and brown people coming in. We need them at a senior level. We need to create the dynamics where we can promote them. We want all of that. But racism, it's not really us. It's all out there, despite the fact that all the Black and brown staff are saying it's really problematic, right? So there's this gap, right? What we say, what we experience, and what the organizations experience, right? What is it that creates that gap? What is it that stops us from recognizing that we're all socialized and conditioned in the dynamics of racism, right? Probably every one of us in this room has racist thoughts and pretends that you don't. And this is the point where I see a couple of nods and most people in the room normally go, right? Yes, I am talking about you looking down, right? I know that you get racist thoughts because I get them. Okay, I've had to do a huge amount of work about my anti-Blackness. There's huge levels of racism against Black communities in my community, my South Asian community, right? Thank you, Lola. I see that you put a heart up, right? And I can just feel that fizziness again, right? So, and also I've held so many sessions, right? And I know what's in the room, right? Now, the majority of our communication is non-verbal, right? There's some of you in this room that know much more about this than I do, but from the research that I've looked at, the reports show that between 55 and 93% of our communication is non-verbal. I don't know why there's such a difference. I think it's the parameters of the report. So it comes out in eye contact, tone of voice, body movements, it comes out in your behaviors, right? So your conditioning, your socialization and conditioning, that socialization and conditioning, and we could break that down if we had more time, but it's what's leading to those racist thoughts, right? Leaks. So the more you shove it down, the more it leaks, right? Because the majority of your communication is non-verbal and therefore unconscious. So that conditioning is all coming out. So people like me, right, we have very highly tuned bullshit detectors, because we've been living around the dynamics of racism all our lives, right? And the people of color in the room know what I'm talking about. The women know what I'm talking about. The queers know what I'm talking about, right? And so you think that it's not us, it's out there, and you're being very polite and speaking very nicely, and we're like, yeah, I see what you're doing right now, right? Or and you know, and it's people in this room that have also been responsible for some of these dynamics that I've experienced, right? Where I've been in spaces with you, where you've invited me into places where you've talked over me, you haven't really listened to what I've got to say, and you're recreating those dynamics, right? It happens regularly all the time, and it's all of us, right? So what is that gap about? What does it take for us to show up? What does it take to create the dynamics around us, for us, where we can create learning spaces that are non-judgmental, where we can talk about these issues? It's really tough talking about these issues. I really know that for many of you, there's a real fear, right? What can we do to create the systems and the spaces where we can look at these dynamics, where we can change these dynamics, where we're willing to show up, where we're willing to recognize this, right? It's about being compassionate, creating good learning experiences so that people can grow. But then what you do is what happens, the last point is what happens is when people do start to grow, there's that initial gap. Then when people do start to grow and start to recognize what's going on, there's a huge gap between there and action, right? Action where you show up, where you bring change, where you challenge the dynamics, right? Where you speak out, right? I'm in the middle of this really intense program at the moment. We were talking about this yesterday, and we've done weeks and weeks of work, and still there's so much freeze. We all have trauma in our systems, not just people that look like me. White people also have a lot of trauma around these dynamics, right? So we have to create trauma-informed spaces to do the work. But what is it that is in the way of us showing up and doing the work? What creates these disparities in levels of awareness? What is it that means that where it means that it's not us, it's them, it's always somebody else? And what is it that stops us taking action? Those are my questions to you. Thank you. How am I for time, Tom?
You've got 30 seconds if you want to.
Booyaka!
Well done. Thank you very much. You've really seeded thoughts for the dialogue. Raggi, I think what I'd like is if you would say your sort of conclusion piece now.
I'm really moved by this conversation, right? When I'm in groups and people talk about being moved, I sometimes think, what are you actually talking about, right? And I now know, right? Because I'm feeling it, right? And at points of this conversation, there's been such an exhaustion and heaviness, right? And kind of, oh, it's all just all hopeless. And then there's been moments where the whole energy has shifted. What creates those dynamics? For me, what creates those dynamics, in me personally, are conversations like this, doing the work, showing up, having the discussions, right? I find these, I feel really enthusiastic when I see the work being done. And this is the work, right? These conversations are the work, right? The one thing that I really noticed, despite the fact that I said that we're all socialized and conditioned in the dynamics of racism, and actually I've been in rooms with people in this room and I've experienced direct racism. Mostly there's been a couple of moments where we're coming close to it or naming things, but mostly what we've been doing is talking externally. What do we need to do in the organizations? What do we need to do out there? What about us taking accountability for ourselves? Yeah. Right? It starts with us. We are all socialized and conditioned. You know that you get those racist thoughts, right? And there's a whole load of learning that you can do about what happens around that and how that plays out, right? So actually we're part of the problem, all of us, but we never take responsibility for ourselves. It's always out there. And that's where the gap is in the organizations. It's not us, it's everybody out there. Until we can become humble enough to do the growing and the learning ourselves, right, and create the dynamics and the spaces where people can show up and do that learning, despite the fact that it's challenging, it's difficult, right, it's sticky, right, we're not going to bring that change, I don't think, right. The second thing I notice is most of what we're doing is we're looking towards the white people. Racism comes externally as dominance and it comes internally as oppression. And a really big part of my work is, what do we do for the racialized folk, for the Black folks, to support them and build them up? Because we all suffer from huge levels of internalized oppression and from racism and trauma, etc. And we're always doing this work. Let's educate the white people. If they're just educated a bit more, it will be better. But what about building us up from our core? So actually, we do this work simultaneously so that we grow in the organizations, we grow with our own personal power, and what happens externally, one, either we challenge it or we're not so bothered, or or we can get to the positions where we can earn that money anyway, right? We do have to change the systems, absolutely, but I think within that, some of that impetus and money and development needs to go within us, right, and not just externally. I think that's all I want to say. There's a million things to say of what's coming in the room, right? I really believe in change. I see it, right? I believe in it. I think it's really challenging, but I think it requires all of us to be willing to get our hands dirty and see the dynamics in ourselves and create the conversations around us, and be part of those conversations rather than the good people, right? What Robin DiAngelo calls the good bad binary, right? We're the good ones. We're the ones that are bringing change, and all the bad people are all of those people, those bosses, those all of these other people who are trying to change. It's not just that. It's all of us. And for me, I spend a lot of my work challenging the dynamics of racism as they appear within me, not just say my anti-blackness, but my internalized oppression. I've worked really hard of changing that, and that changes it from everyone around me, my communities around me, and in the places that I go in. And I can come in and I can speak from a heart space, right? Which brings change. It was really important to hit people on an emotional level because I'm more empowered. And of course, it still deeply pains me. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Raggi. Okay, well, we'll draw it to a close then. Thank you very, very much, everybody. Thank you, Raggi.
Pleasure.
I really appreciate the work that you're doing, and as you know, I've done your program, and it just left me at the end of it saying I need to do it again, because there's just so much unpeeling to do, and it just doesn't happen overnight. So thank you to all. Do join us next month when I'm going to be talking about bullying and harassment, and thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
Raggi.
Bye.
Thank you.